Hello and welcome to Y Button, the podcast that asks why we care about video games. I'm your host, Kyle Starr. On this show, I interview creators, enthusiasts, journalists, and media personalities about their origins with video games, what keeps them so interested in the medium, and what excites them about the future. On this episode, I interview Stephen Hilger, co-host of the Into the Aether podcast. For those keeping score, I've completed interviewing the Triforce of Into the Aether, the wisdom, the power, the courage, and I'm never going to tell you which one is which, but I've caught them all. It took a while for Stephen and I to connect due to a couple false starts, and therefore he was in the thick of the summer break for Into the Aether. I like to think that I gave him an opportunity to warm up for the main gig when they come back. This is the first time I've connected with Stephen face-to-face. I'm a huge fan of his work on Into the Aether, and was happy to experience and capture the same infectious and big energy he brings to that show. While we do talk a lot about Into the Aether, a large portion of this chat swirls around childhood, art, imagination. It's one of my favorite conversations on this show. Stephen Allen Hilger, thanks for joining me.
Alan? I like that.
I took a big swing. Was it even close?
Kind of. It's Paul is my middle name, but
Paul.
I don't know if I've ever revealed that. So you're about as close as you could have been, you know?
Well, I was assuming it was Alan spelt with one L, so yeah. I got four letters. So
yeah, you had a good Wordle first try there for sure.
That's awesome. That's going to be a new theme. I had a couple episodes back. I had the two Pauls from Two Player Productions at Double Fine join the show,
amazing.
And now
Wow.
I've got yet a third Paul on the show.
I'm happy to be here. Proud to take the bronze of the Pauls.
Welcome to Paul Button.
It's almost Paul Bunyan. I like it.
Well, thank you for joining Y Button. Thank you for hopping on the show with me. We for folks at home who are listening, we've had a false start to this a while back. We were supposed to record a few weeks ago, and then a fire at work for me popped up as soon as we hit record, and we had to bail. And then I think you had some time away as well. So
yeah, it was one of those like I can record like tonight or in 7 weeks. And it's like neither of these are good. But I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Cool. And I should say up front too, and this may have been apparent on the Brendan Bigley episode, and there will be an AJ there. Well, by the time this recording comes out, there is an AJ Filari episode, but I am a huge fan of Into the Aether. I'm a huge fan of your work and what you do. And so this is a real thrill for me to have you on the show. So thank you for everything that you've put out there and all the, I guess, inspiration for this show and
Wow.
positive vibes and positivity you've given me over the last few years. So yeah, I'll just start there and make you feel really embarrassed.
Yeah, I'm extremely flattered. It's really nice to hear that. It's a weird thing. I'm sure you experience this too, like doing a podcast, because you hear from people and like, you know, you can engage with listeners, but there isn't that immediate feedback. So it is nice to hear that, because I think I often forget it's not just like a private call between Brendan and myself that like people are actually listening to, you know. So I'm really glad it's had that positive effect for you. That's lovely to hear.
Some folks have listened to, I'm sure, listened to Into the Aether. There's some of the folks who listen to the show do, you know, cross over into your world, and were probably introduced to Y Button through Into the Aether. And the folks who have listened to the Brendan Bigley episode or the AJ Filari episode at this point know a bit about the show. But can you tell me a bit about yourself? And I guess, who are you? Who is
Who is this?
Who is Stephen Paul Hilger?
Wow, that's a good question. I've been asking myself that these days. No, but I mean, Into the Aether, I'll start there and see if I could find the self-confidence to answer your second question. Into the Aether is a low-key video game podcast, how we describe it. It really just began, Brendan and I had collaborated in the past. We had written for a video game website for like a year or so, shortly after I graduated college. And we had also just always like we went to high school together, but we were never like in the same circle, but we always wanted to be. There was always this weird like appreciation from afar, like this kind of like weird acknowledgement of like we would probably be really good friends, but we were not in the same class or given the chance to like hang out. So it wasn't until like I graduated college that we started hanging out, and then also like quickly learning that we just really clicked creatively. It's a hard thing to find. Like I remember in college, like I have a background in performing and in comedy and stuff and writing, and I draw a lot. So like that's kind of the mix of stuff that I do. But in college, I remember kind of being like my first mission when I got to school was like, I want to find people to collaborate with. Like I want to find like my creative team. And I've always just been like attracted to that type of, I don't know, like creative space. Like there are some things that I'm comfortable taking on by myself, but I think especially in college when you're like trying to find your place in a social setting, like the same way some people want to join like a team or whatever, like that was like my drive. And so I'd had an experience like meeting people, like bonding over shared interests and then trying to collaborate. And it's a really hard thing to find like when it works well, because it's a very special relationship that you have to discover, and you can only really discover it by like trying multiple times. Brendan and I think just kind of knew like, oh, like we are on the same page and we kind of complement each other well. And so there was always that desire to do something together. It wasn't, and then, you know, our ill-fated attempts to make that happen. I moved to Chicago like 20 minutes after we started hanging out. And then that kind of, you know, it wasn't until years later that he reached out and was like, hey, like I miss talking about video games. Like, do you want to record something together? Like he's always been interested in podcasts, like even before they were like a mainstream thing. He's always 5 years ahead of everything. He's just that kind of guy. And
that's
and
why
I
I call
admire
him
that about
Brennan 5 years ahead of
yeah, that's got the cooler middle name. I got St. Paul and he got the 5 years ahead guy. But yeah, when he reached out, that was the beginning. And that really, as much as we've grown and we're now like thinking about stuff for the show and making plans that I don't think we would ever have thought would be possible when we started. Like that really is the heart of the show that we try to maintain, is like, it's just us trying to keep in touch and like share our passion for games. And that's what we do. We just talk about games that we really enjoy, and we make an effort to highlight like games that we like. And in recent years, it's also been, I think we've started to kind of lean retro. So like the structure of the show is basically every week we'll bring up games we're playing that we're enjoying. And that can be new stuff. It could be old stuff. It's been nice kind of having a loose structure for the weekly format. And then around once a month, we will do what we call a bonus episode. And that is always about like one game or series. So that will be kind of a deeper dive into like one game. So we've done a lot of those at this point, and that has kind of become in some ways like the main event of the show. Like I think, you know, it's interesting to see kind of what eras of games we kind of gravitate towards. And in more recent years, we started doing our season premiere all about one console. So we started doing that with the Game Boy Advance, which you made incredible Game Boy Advances for us for that giveaway.
Thank you for letting me be a part of that, by the way. That was so fun.
It was incredible. Like we were happy to feature your work. And that's the thing too. And that has kind of started more recent conversations about game preservation. And like we've done these episodes where our mission is just to highlight all the games we like for that console, but then we realize that there's no way to directly legally play a lot of this stuff, which is really sad. So it's been, I mean, we just, it's not out yet, but we have recorded, at the time of this recording, we have already recorded the Dreamcast premiere. And that is a really interesting era. So I think what has kind of started as like just a way for us to speak to our passion for games has also become like us learning about game history and applying it to the present as well, which has been really rewarding. Like I definitely think I know significantly more about my own tastes and about game history than when we started. So it's been a really rewarding process.
Yeah, and there's a few things that you mentioned there. I think one was you talked about the chemistry with you and Brendan, and you know, you talked about the heart of the show. And I truly think that, you know, when I think of your show, this sounds kind of gross as I'm saying it, I think of like hearts, like that is like there's such a warmth to the show, and you feel the chemistry in the show. You feel the bond you two have, and now you've gone 5 seasons of this. Is 5 years, or are we starting year 6? Where are we in the timeline?
I think it's been 5 years, and we're starting season 6.
And you've recorded, I mean, and it's weekly. It's a weekly show, but you've certainly recorded well more than what would be a weekly show. You guys have probably done double that at this point. But
yeah, we I think have earned like a mixed reputation for episode length. Although I think over like a normal episode will usually be like 90 minutes to 2 hours, 2 hours on the longer side. The bonuses will kind of be as long as they need to. So like the Dreamcast episode is a absurd length. I'll warn you right now, but it's weird. I mean, the episodes we release that are like gigantic tend to do pretty well. So like it's nice that our hubris is rewarded, where we can like just, and I think it's less that we want to make this episode as long as possible. It's not ever our mission. Our mission is to like let the episode be as long as it needs to be. And I think that usually works. So I'm glad we can release a 5-hour episode and no one laughs at us anymore. We proved them wrong. Yeah.
Well, I think the fans, myself included, look forward to those long ones. You know, if you give us an 8-hour episode, I'm here for it. I just get worried that I'm going to get behind on the next episode that's coming, right? By the time I'm done with one of these huge episodes, if it's 8 hours long or whatever, I've got 3 more in the tank and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to those right before the next one comes out. So I'm constantly trying to, like, it's a race against time with your show for me, but I also like that. And I do find that there's sort of an evergreenness to your episodes where I can go back to an episode that you recorded 2 years ago and it still feels relevant. You know, as you mentioned, you do talk about a lot of retro stuff on the show, not necessarily purposefully, but it's what you're playing now and what you're into. You're not staying necessarily up to date with the latest and greatest or whatever's just come out and focusing on a review of that. You're just talking about what you're playing and what you enjoy, and that could be something that was released 20 years ago, right? And you're just bringing it to the table. I discovered this because of this, and you have turned me and I think many others on to lots of games that would be outside of their periphery because they're just not in the zeitgeist right now, or they came from an era past, right? So
yeah, I think that's, I'm really happy to hear that, and I think that's something that I'm really proud of with the show, specifically like encouraging people who may think like, oh, this isn't for me, to try it out, because, and that's also like, I think video games are new enough that there are, you know, generations that still think of it as a toy, or as like, it's not taken as seriously as other art forms. But even still, like people around my age or our age, like growing up, the marketing of games was so overall rancid that I feel like for a lot of people, they probably felt bullied out of even trying to enjoy them, you know? Mm-hmm. And like, not to say that, you know, not to give ourselves too much credit, but like, it's been really great to see people in the Discord and people in my life too, who had convinced themselves or had been convinced by outside forces that this wasn't for them, suddenly be on their 4th run of Fire Emblem 3 Houses, or like, you know, have Excel spreadsheets of like Persona Fusion strategies. And like, that's what I love, because it's the minute you apply "this isn't for me" to any other medium, it sounds so silly and so backwards. Like, oh yeah, books aren't for me, or, you know. And I know it's different with games, because the other side of it too is that there's so much, it's such a big ask, like financially and time wise, and also just like, I have to remember that I've been playing these things my whole life, so there's some muscle memory that I just take for granted. Like I had a friend who is more recent to games, and she played a game specifically that had a rotating camera on a joystick just to get used to that control scheme, which I wouldn't have thought of like as a thing to get used to. But that's like, again, if you didn't grow up with this stuff, it's a pretty intimidating ask. So yeah, all that to say, like, I'm very happy that, you know, an extension of the show has been this influence of like people trying something they maybe thought that they couldn't experience themselves.
Where did you actually start with video games? What was your first console? I should start there, actually.
That's a good question. So I was born in 1990, which I feel like is, you know, the beginning of the Nintendo like dominance era. My family already had an NES by the time I was born, and my first like formative memories playing games are largely with the Super Nintendo. But even those are kind of foggy. I have a very concrete memory of that hazy time playing Super Nintendo as like a 3, 4, 5-year-old with my older sister, and us referring to the NES as old Nintendo. So like even from birth, the NES it was always retro. It's always, but even in the time where it was only like a few years old, it was still old Nintendo. So Super Nintendo, I would guess would be like my first, although it was sort of like we had both and we played both off and on. The first console that I remember like more directly and felt more like, oh, this is mine, and this is like a time in my life where I'm playing games on a level past, like, because I think when I was a kid, games were largely social. Like my parents and I played together, my sister and I played together, you know, friends would come over, I imagine I probably thought of playing Batman Returns the same way I thought of playing with my action figures, you know, but playing like Super Mario 64 for the first time at like age 7, I remember that I remember having my mind actually like melt, just being like, oh, I can move in any direction. Are you kidding? It makes me sound so old, but like that was really incredible. And I would say N64 is like my foundation overall. N64 PS1 era is kind of where I think I was starting to develop my own taste and wasn't just sort of playing what was put in front of me.
It's interesting you say that about the control. Like I had never thought really or been that considered about thinking about, you know, growing up with input. I talk on the show a lot about growing up with games and growing up with the medium and seeing how the medium evolves. And I think about it from, every time I've said that, I've thought about it from more of a software level. Like, this is just an action platformer, or, you know, and story was very, you know, not really considered in the early days. And now you have games that their whole point is narrative, right? And that's all it's trying to that's all you're trying to get out of it, or games that are, you know, built like movies, like cinema, basically. The Last of Us or Uncharted, anything that Naughty Dog's putting out basically is meant to feel like a movie. I had never really given much consideration to the fact that we grew up with a D-pad and 2 buttons, and then a D-pad and 4 buttons, or some shoulder, but 6 buttons, you know, whatever it is. And we saw the growth of input devices as well. And then come the Nintendo 64, just like you're saying with Super Mario 64, you now have an analog stick, and we're playing with the camera. Basically, you know, that was unheard of until that point, to be able to control the camera, at least at that level, basically. And we've just seen that input grow and grow and grow all the way to where we are now with potentially VR and all of that. But our generation got to experience all that and grow with the input as well. Where if you tried to introduce somebody to gaming today, and I hear this from other from parents and others, where if you try to put a 3D game in front of a child, they have a very difficult time spatially figuring out how to control this thing. I'm not only controlling the character in front of me, but I have to maintain this camera as well. And it is very advanced. It's very tricky, which I think is why a lot of folks who are new to the medium start with 2D, or just touching on a device, you know, something that has fairly simple inputs to it. And then through this show, it's very interesting to learn where people started, like where they have that not formative, I guess, yet, but where they recall getting into games, but then the consoles that really help them build that sort of taste for games, right? Where it no longer jumped the gap from becoming a toy, or from being a toy, to being something different, to opening up other doors or worlds, or opening up your imagination about what's possible. For me, I have vivid memories, and maybe not vivid memories, but maybe it's that same foggy but concrete memories of playing Mega Man 2 on an NES at my babysitter's house when I was very, very young. And I grew to, I think, appreciate the NES because my cousin had one and other people had one, and I always wanted to go play it because it was a video game. I wanted to touch this thing and play with this thing. But I never had a console until the Sega Genesis, or no, I had a Game Boy and then the Sega Genesis. And that's kind of where I had my own toy to play with. I had my own thing to play with. But just like you, once I saw Mario 64 and started playing with, you know, Nintendo 64 games, I think it started becoming a little bit different. For me, I think the PS2 and playing things like Final Fantasy X sort of opened that. Like, I started seeing where this is now. I don't necessarily know if saying cinematic or cinema is the right way to say, but I could start seeing these like big stories, these big narratives. The potential here was with PS2, and that was actually my high school years. But that's kind of where I kind of lean in, and I'm actually looking right over now at my Nintendo 64 and my PS2, and that's for whatever reason, those are the retro consoles that I have set aside, and I think that there's a reason for that, right? Like, there's a reason I lean into those two. So
yeah, I think you're right to point out the cinematic nature of that generation, because I think something about like PS2, PS3, even more so, I think as games were sort of like beckoning to be taken more seriously by the mainstream, they sought to emulate TV and movies more directly. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, that led to stuff like Uncharted and Last of Us, you know. But at the same time, what I've really learned doing the show and playing a lot of stuff for the show is I'm learning that my definition of narrative in cinematic is widening. You know, I think like in a more direct way, like, yeah, absolutely. Like Uncharted, Last of Us, Final Fantasy X, very cinematic games. I was thinking about Final Fantasy X when you asked me that question, because actually PS2 was the first system I bought for myself. That was like the point where my parents were like, enough. Like, if you're going to keep doing this, you got to work at summer camp as a counselor. Well, that was my choice, but that was like when I continued it on my own. And yeah, Final Fantasy X was a big deal. That was like the first voice acted Final Fantasy.
Yeah, man.
I kept thinking about Final Fantasy X as I was playing Dreamcast, because there are a handful of really good RPGs on the Dreamcast. I'm like, these are so good. Why didn't no one play them? And then I look at the dates and it's like in the black hole vortex of Final Fantasy X. I'm like, no. But yeah, going back to cinematic and narrative, like, I think we use it to describe games that are like cutscene heavy or focusing on spectacle in some way. And narrative, we think about, also cutscenes or maybe like a lot of text. But I would argue you can say like a game's narrative doesn't have to be that. I think there's a lot of narrative in just the world design of a game like Breath of the Wild or Shadow of the Colossus, where like there may not be something happening directly. There may not be like information being given to the player in like a line of dialogue or a cutscene, but just being in that place and the way it's designed, the way it like looks and feels is a storytelling moment, even if it's not direct or reminiscent of what we get in TV or movies. And I think that's where I'm most interested in kind of exploring games, is seeing like what can they do uniquely. I think a lot of games in the 2010s, once we kind of got past we can be movies, it was like we can be choose your own adventure movies. And we got stuff like Mass Effect and games that were maybe like AAA versions of D&D in a lot of ways, like trying to capture that scope of role-playing possibility, but give it more kind of flair and polish, and make it feel like bigger for mainstream audiences. And that's really cool. And I mean, I'm a huge Mass Effect fan and I love games that are choice driven. But again, like I think I'm just learning that narrative can be more subtle and cinematic doesn't have to mean cutscenes. I hope to one day have more language to back that up, but that's just been one of my more recent observations in doing the show.
And in doing the show, I'm going to zero in on that a little bit. You mentioned playing so many games for the show. You guys are also have been on a little bit of I don't want to call it hiatus. You sort of cut, you ended your last season, you're gearing up for the next season. You took this 2-month summer break off. But before that, you were, and probably still are, playing a ton of games. I'm very curious what your relationship with games is now, and maybe how does that compare, or how has that evolved over time into where it is now? Because you play quite a few games. So
yeah,
has that always been the case, I guess, is the question.
Some people are like concerned. I think they're like, are you all right? Are you sick? Like what's up? It hasn't really changed much. I think the biggest thing, I mean, it depends. I think like because we have a pretty flexible structure and because like games we're bringing to the show on a weekly basis, I think we try to make an effort to say like, have we played this game for like an hour or two and this is like a first impressions conversation? Or did we like binge this over the weekend and we're like coming with unhinged, chaotic energy about like our love for this thing? So I think like there's no pressure for weekly episodes to like really get to a certain point in a game because we're open to bringing it up more than once. So and that's happened before. And we've even had cases where like famously Dragon Quest 11, I brought to the show like pretty early on and I'd played like a decent chunk of it and like liked it enough. But I was just sort of like, yeah, this game's pretty cool. I felt like I liked it enough to bring it up, but I don't know if I'm going to stick around. And then Brendan had like a religious experience with it. And then I felt the need to go back to it. And then also really fell in love with it like my second time around. So I think like allowing for that flexibility of returning to games, I think allows for cases like that, where it's not just like a one and done, I got my take, I'm moving on. It's like our relationship with media can change over time. But to answer your question, I think the biggest change has just been like, I have to be pretty diligent with how I'm spending my time on other things.
Sure.
So like we both work full time. I also draw a lot. Like I'm an artist and I have my own like comic projects I'm working on. I'm hoping to share more of that, in the near future, because that's something it's been like super private. And I sometimes get like, it's weird. I think I've always been drawn to many pursuits. So like in college, I, did acting and I was also writing, and drawing was like a hobby then, and then kind of became more of a serious pursuit later in my life. So that's all great. And it's like pursuing different art forms, you learn about the other one when you're doing one of them in a weird way. Like I think you learn about acting when you're writing, or you learn about art when you're writing. It's hard to describe, but I do think it's like I subjectively love kind of having that variety. But the flip side of that is just like 8 different versions of imposter syndrome. So like it's always just like, I swear I'm all these things, guys, which, you know, is totally just on my end. But like that is going back to like, you know, in college and creative partnerships, like there are eras of my life where I think I'm more active in one place. Like in college, I was definitely performing way more than I was maybe writing. And I think I always want to do the other thing when I'm doing the other thing, you know?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But all that to say, like, because of that, I have to be like, okay, like, what am I prioritizing with my time? Like the show, drawing, my job, seeing friends. You know, there was a time in my life where I really like put a lot of my personal needs aside just to like be as productive as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a poisonous behavior. Don't do that. Make time for your friends and for sleep and stuff. And yeah, for the show, I think like games have always been social for me. And especially as an adult, like games have been like a really big stress release. Like there was a solid year of my life where like every day after work, I would just come home and play Overwatch for like 2 hours. And that was like my wind down game. Even before doing the show, though, like I did still have an interest in checking out new things. I think the big game that kind of got me back into checking out new releases was Persona 5. Because before then I was pretty comfortable like playing Overwatch and then like revisiting RPGs of the past, like replaying Dragon Age or Skyrim or Mass Effect. And then Persona 5 came out and I was like, what? this is possible? They make games like this now? Like it really felt like everything I had kind of liked about Final Fantasy, like that sense of ensemble and character, but like they really made a game out of being good friends, you know, like they just made a game out of friendship.
Yeah.
Or about friendship, like mechanically. So that was a big moment. And then, you know, a year later, the show started. So I guess the biggest like relationship change has just been like, I think we've kind of developed a natural rhythm of like Brendan and I will just play whatever we're genuinely interested in that week. Cause that way it won't feel forced when we record. And then we'll bring up like, oh, like I was playing this week, or, you know, I was drawn to this. And I find when we kind of play organically, like what we want, there's a weird kind of thread throughout the month where like we might be like drawn to certain genres or like exploring certain series. The only time it becomes a little bit more strict with like, I actually can't play what I want. I have to play Chrono Trigger or something, which I always want to play. But when we do bonuses or when we're like gearing up for Game of the Year or like our season premieres, which are about one console, I would say the time where I actually have to like I can't play anything else is like the lead up to the Dreamcast recording. I had to only play Dreamcast stuff. And I loved that. It was really cool. But it is like, it does feel like more of a mission and less of a pastime. It doesn't feel like work. I think we do a lot to make sure we don't resent playing games, but it also feels like this is something that I have to do. I guess to put it concisely, like I think week by week, we try to just do what we would normally do, you know, even if we weren't doing a show, and let that be the conversation. And for like bonuses or bigger episodes, it becomes a little bit more of a direct task. But I think we enjoy that, you know, assignment. Like we enjoy that work that goes into those episodes because it leads to a really fun recording. It does warp that experience to not be like, oh, I'm playing this to unwind or to escape or to like, you know, get lost in a game. It becomes a little bit more analytical in some ways.
And if you didn't have the show, would you be playing as many games as you do today?
No. I think to put it bluntly, no. I definitely think I would probably be finishing more stuff if I had to guess. I'm trying to think of how I was before we started recording, and like I was still playing a lot. I mean, before we did the show, I had been like, when I got into Persona 5, I then purchased 3 and 4 and beat them both in the span of like a few months, which is wild. Those games are very long. So like something was brewing within me that, you know, was leading to starting a game podcast. But would I on my own will just be like, I'm going to play every Dreamcast game? Probably not. I would probably maybe check out 1 or 2 like of interest to me. I think games would still be a big part of my life. And that's the big thing, you know, going back to what we're talking about, like when was the formative entry point? Like when did you like decide or discover that games were going to be like a big part of your life? It was when they started influencing other parts of my life. Like I remember when Majora's Mask came out, I started drawing my own masks and brought them to school.
Whoa.
And still to this day, I feel like as an artist, a lot of my style I find is influenced by like a lot of, you know, video game artwork or video game characters. Like, I just find that I draw a lot of inspiration from games in a way that I don't as much from other media. So I think that would not change. I think like my reverence for games and my passion for the games that I love, that was always going to be there. But yeah, I think the speed and frequency would be a little bit different in terms of what I'm playing. Yeah.
You sort of beat me to my next question there, with, kind of where it started for you, again, talking about those hazy memories and all of that. But the reasons I think why you grew attached to this, for some people, it's an escape. I think for myself, there was a bit of an escape to it. It allowed me to kind of be in another place that I felt may have been more joyous or happy. And for others, and I'm hearing from yourself too, it actually was more of like a kind of helped your imagination grow. Right. Like, like you found imagination in it. You found not necessarily escape, but you found inspiration from the medium. I think that's what I'm getting at.
And I wanted to share it with people too. I mean, like a lot of my closest friendships, like there is usually a game that I have in common with that person, especially friendships from the past, like in college and stuff. One of my closest friends, we met in a playwriting class where we were paired together and we just were given a prompt and we basically wrote Mass Effect fan fiction by accident. And then we're like, wait, you're into this, right? And then, we've been friends ever since. So like, I also, one of my truly dorkiest moments as a human being, it was in middle school where I would bring like a stack of strategy guides to lunch. And I was just like, I think I've always just been waiting to start a video game podcast now that I reflect on chapters of my life. But like specifically like Final Fantasy VII, like that game truly changed my life and means so much to me. And
how so? Do you mind if I interrupt you there?
Sure. I mean, I feel like that game to me was what Star Wars is or was to a lot of people. Like there's just that piece of media that does kind of spark your imagination. I've talked about this game a lot on the show, and we have an episode about it, which I imagine I reflect on this in some way. But the big thing I always think of, like the statement that comes to mind about that game, was that it showed me that fantasy could be anything, because I think when we say fantasy, we often think of Tolkien, which is great. I love Lord of the Rings and I love stuff that draws from that. But having this game kind of be set in this like grungy sort of North Jersey, New York, where I'm from, like place, it reminded me of like an industrial area. And it weirdly, even though it's this kind of sort of apocalyptic setting, there's something about it that feels like a relatable home, this place that like has visible problems, but people are just like getting on with their lives. I don't know if I would have said that as a kid, but I do think there was something weirdly like grounded about it that made me very immersed in the place, but it also still had dragons and magic and stuff in it. And I found it to be really transportive. And I think that was the game that kind of, I think we all have the things we look for in art. Like we all like are like, oh, I love like a good heist, or I love like an adventure movie, or I love like a romance. And I feel like that game showed me I love an ensemble. Like I really love an ensemble driven story. And I've also discovered that a lot of my favorite stories are about kind of learning to open up to people. One of my favorite Miyazaki films is Porco Rosso, which is basically the same arc as Cloud. It's just this kind of vaguely shitty guy who thinks he's Humphrey Bogart and doesn't believe himself worthy of affection or intimacy or like love, basically. And seeing a character kind of break through that, I don't know, I just find that to be very beautiful. So I love an ensemble. I love a good arc. That's what I learned from Final Fantasy VII as a 9-year-old.
Life lessons right there. I think you're right. Like seeing something like Star Wars or Final Fantasy VII, where there's an element of like on the surface, if you just saw a like concept art or drawing, you'd say that's sci-fi. But then you start understanding like what's going on or seeing how the world works, the universe works, and all of a sudden it becomes fantasy. But with both of those, and maybe more so with Final Fantasy, you can see you and the world you live in this place.
Yeah.
But with Final Fantasy, like you said, it's in the future, sure, but you can see the sort of like the evils of capitalism and the corruption that ensues.
Yeah, that game comes unfortunately more relatable as time goes on.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm trying to get at. So that relatability, I think, is interesting, and it's not just specific to the medium of video games, but that story alone, I think, is you can relate so heavily to it that it can just easily draw you in, right?
Yeah, I think also on like a more surface level, I think that was the game that taught me that like RPGs were my thing. Like, because my formative games were mostly like Nintendo platformers, which I still love. Like I'm very excited for the new Mario. That's gonna be great. But like
Elephant Mario.
no, that's an RPG. Yeah. I really liked sort of the planning phase of an RPG, like the materia. So every Final Fantasy kind of works differently, but in 7 there's a materia system where prior to that game, usually characters would be tied to one class. So like this character is a healer or this character is a warrior. But in Final Fantasy 7, they're not really like every class is sort of like a modern approximation of an old D&D class. Like Tifa, you could argue, is like a monk. Aerith is kind of the healer. But what materia allows you to do is you can essentially equip these magical orbs into their weapons and armor that will give them different spells and abilities. So you have a little bit more flexibility over how each character plays. I'm amazed I didn't get into D&D younger because I just loved that sort of character building process as well.
That sounds like such your jam, though. Like you're into performance and drama and games and fantasy, and like D&D sounds like that is you. Let's go back to the question of who is Stephen Paul Hilger, and it could be D&D champion.
I'm the dungeon master.
Dungeon master.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I moved to Chicago shortly after graduating college, kind of with the plan of like fully pursuing comedy. So I think that's kind of how I've been seen by most of my friends, and kind of what I was known for in college was like acting and specifically comedic acting. But I also loved writing, and like I loved any kind of storytelling that was available to me. So I think one of my prouder achievements in college was getting to write this one act play, and my friend directed it and we like performed it, and having like an audience for something that I had written was also like as gratifying to me as performing in a play too. So I kind of waffled between like which one meant more to me. And then when I graduated, I think I was like, okay, I'm just gonna move to Chicago and like do the comedy thing. And I was doing a lot of performing in my early years there. But then I kind of quickly learned that I really missed the creative control of writing. And I also kind of learned that I maybe didn't love stand up or sketch or improv as much as I thought I did. Mm-hmm. Like I still loved comedy and performing, but I wasn't sure like what outlet was for me, because stand-up is like, I have nothing but respect for people that like make that work, because that is the most thankless type of performance there is. I did it between the ages of 19 and 25, and I enjoyed it and I found some success with it. But like, I feel like that's one of those things where that has to be like the thing you love, or you kind of drop it at some point. And, it's been cool to see like colleagues of mine who have stuck with it, like find a lot of success. It's amazing. I think that's also kind of part of the course with like post-grad life. Like you kind of figure out like, okay, I remember just having this feeling of being ankle deep in 8 different things and wanting to be knee deep in like 2 or 3. So I think I just had to decide like, what is it that I want to do? And that's when I pivoted to drawing and writing more. And that was amazing. And really, I found a lot of inspiration from that. But I missed the other thing. I missed performing. And what's been so gratifying, kind of in a selfish way, with Into the Aether is like, it really has felt like the perfect outlet for me. It kind of feels like all the pieces, not that it's like the end all be all of my performer side, but it's been the perfect thing for me these past 5 years to like engage with that other half, to like be myself, but also be, performing in some capacity. Like I'm not being a character, like I'm being me, but I'm able to tap into the comedy side a little bit. And to like, what I liked about stand-up was I was able to kind of be myself and connect with people on stage. And that's what I'm able to do with the show. And also I can live my 7-year-old dreams of showing up to a lunch table with a stack of game magazines, but people actually want to hear it this time. So I'm living the dream. I hope that answers your question. I know it's a lot of info at once.
No, you did. And you sort of answered another question I was going to ask. Do you think that background in performance and performing arts has helped you with the show? As a listener, I feel like it totally comes out. Like, I can see your enthusiasm and performance on the show, but it also, to carry the show for as long as you all have, the 5 years plus just countless hours and these long episodes, like you're able to do that without seeing seemingly without any problem or issue, and you're just having fun with it the whole time. For me, it's a struggle just to get through an hour and a half of this show until like I'm on afterward. I'm like, oh my God, my brain's melting. What am I doing?
Yeah. I definitely think it has. I mean, especially the improv part of it. Like I haven't done like, improv on stage in a very long time, but I've always liked kind of being a bit on my feet. And I think the big thing I've learned in my years like performing and specifically with improv is like really trusting the ensemble, trusting your scene partner, and I think Brendan and I think have a lot of trust in each other. Like I think once we did that episode where we didn't even have any games, Brendan had just changed his PlayStation username. And that was an episode, and it was like a good one. We were like, we can do whatever the hell we want at this point. Like we don't need to do anything. But I think kind of knowing, and that's the other thing too, is like, I know that there are people in my life who listen to the show and in the nicest way possible, like don't really care about games, but they just like our banter. And I'm glad that can like, that it's enjoyable, even if you don't know what 13 Sentinels is, like, I think that's
100%.
That's something that we kind of hoped for. And I'm glad that works for some people. But yeah, I think I don't see it as like a performance, but that's also just kind of who I am. Like I've always, as a kid, figuring out like what is my hobby or what is my thing, like trying every sport, trying, Boy Scouts and band and all of that. Like it really, once I was able to do theater, that's where I kind of found like, oh yeah, this clicks very nicely. I did like soccer. Shout out to soccer for just being like a nice fall run. But theater and art class were definitely like the things that lit my brain up as a kid.
Mm. You've mentioned it a few times. Where I'm going to move kind of straight back into video games.
Yeah, please do.
No, this is all interesting because I do think it all sort of connects, right? For the heart of the show, this show, asking about why each individual guest cares about games. You hear a lot of the same themes. You hear a lot of differences, and I think a lot of it stems from where we were introduced to games and why. Or what impact it had on us from the beginning. And we see how the way we think about games affect other parts of our lives. One thing I did not expect to come up on the show quite often is how games can relate to music. And I had never made that connection. And I'm very enthusiastic about music. You can see my record collection behind me.
Yeah. And your guitar.
And my guitar. I've got a couple other guitars in the closet.
That's awesome.
I was in punk bands in high school and have always just had this love and enthusiasm for music. And it's not just like, oh, listening is great and these are cool lyrics or a cool song, but it's like digging through the liner notes and being able to figure out like, oh, this band was inspired by this band, or this band is thanking this band, and let me listen to that band, or this person plays on this song. And like that sort of like you start kind of unraveling and going back in history. And I've talked to a few other guests about this thing of like the same thing kind of happens with games, right? Especially, I mean, because this medium is so, I don't know if it's in its infancy. It's come up again a couple times on the show. Is it infancy? Is it a high school kid now? Is it at college? We don't really know where the medium is because it's going to be something completely different in another 20 or 30 years, right? It's just going to keep evolving. But every game that comes out now is so you can draw connection, like direct connections to games that have come out prior to that. Talking about how ITA has kind of gone in a little bit of a retro bent, just naturally over time. I think it's because the connections to the newer games bridged back to those old ones. So I don't know. The long way of me saying that, like, there is this connection between the way a lot of people treat music and the way people treat games is like you can go back in the past and look at some of these things.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, I guess that goes for anything. If you tell me you're an artist, if you draw, you're likely pulling inspiration from things that you have experienced yourself, right? And
yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of how you know if you're a big fan of something is if you get a thrill out of tracing influence, because I think especially
that's what
when
I'm
I was
thank you.
Yeah, when I was younger, like I remember, like, I don't know why I keep talking about my childhood, but I guess it's implicitly linked to or inherently linked to games in some ways. But I remember, like, I've also just been thinking about how much I miss Borders. And I remember, like, in 8th grade, that's when I also kind of got into music, and I would get, like, the bands I was really into in 8th grade and still am are Nirvana and Radiohead. And I just remember trying to figure out, like, what were the bands that led to this, and then that's how I discovered, like, the Pixies and, bands before then even. And that was really cool. I think tracing the influence with games is interesting because I think, and this is something that I talked about recently with our friend Alana when we were talking about game design, is that, like, directly, I don't want to say copying, but I feel like you see it's almost more welcome or invited in games to sort of like more blatantly kind of wear your influence on your sleeves. So like there'll be a game like Hollow Knight that comes out, and then suddenly like there's like 30 games trying to be like Hollow Knight. And then in the case of it being successful, then you have a new genre name like Souls likes, you know? And I think what's been interesting about like a lot of the recent AAA games, like stuff like Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom, is that like the influence people are tracing is not obvious. Like when you play Elden Ring, it weirdly feels a lot like Dragon's Dogma. It feels a lot, you know, Breath of the Wild is obviously there, but you can also think back to even, you know, more to the past stuff like Simon's Quest. Like I feel like Elden Ring in some ways kind of feels like the promise of sort of ambitious but not fully executed RPGs from the 90s or before even. And then with Tears of the Kingdom, the big joke is like, oh, this is just Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts, which, you know, I wouldn't have guessed that the new Zelda would be pulling from that game for influence. And I don't know if they did, to be fair, but it is like fascinating to see like the influence is not always linear is the point I'm trying to make. Like the things as like certain trends come and go or certain styles of design become sort of the standard, we see games from the past kind of echo in different years. Like I think it kind of feels like the era. I mean, open world games are still very much what AAA is going for, but it does feel like they have changed dramatically, even in the past few years. You know, I think for the bulk of the 2010s, it kind of felt like Skyrim adjacent. And with Tears of the Kingdom and Elden Ring, it feels like the beginning of something new. Mm-hmm. And it's ironic, I think, that the influence of the new wave is actually even further retro than the one before it. It's also one's read on influence is a little bit subjective too, because like,
oh, totally, yeah.
Because again, influence is also subconscious. Like you can directly say like, yeah, we were really going after these games with this game, but we're influenced by everything in our life. So it really is open to interpretation, like what is carrying forward.
Sure. And there's more than just games influencing games. There's, you know, other art influencing games.
Yeah.
You sort of touched on it earlier. When you do one thing, you want to do the other, or certain art influences other art as well, right? So, and that's wildly prevalent in video games. And thinking about your own experience of games and touching on the catalog that you've played and experienced and how things have influenced, you know, one another, I want to learn about the games that have really inspired and influenced you've mentioned Final Fantasy VII, and I think you briefly touched on Mass Effect and actually performing Mass Effect fan fiction. I'm not going to get in. I mean, maybe those are the ones, but I'm curious.
Just to clarify, like that play was actually just very much like in space, but then once we had written it, we were both going after Mass Effect, right? Like that was just like Mass Effect fanfic in disguise.
Love it.
But anyway, I'm sorry, you're asking me a question.
Yeah, I'm curious. What are the games that have really just inspired you, or the ones that you go back to as like an anchor or something that really kind of opened your mind at the time? You've touched on a few already, and you can rehash. That's fine too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two big ones that I think were big for a lot of people around my age were Final Fantasy VII and Ocarina of Time. I think Zelda in general, like a lot of those games are just like infinitely replayable. Wind Waker has always been my personal favorite, and I think that also has kind of influenced me outside of just like I want to play a good game, but like I just love the spirit of Wind Waker. Like I love the sense of adventure and that like kind of approach to fantasy, where that game is very unique within the Zelda catalog because it's one of the more self-aware games, but it also is fully confident with what it's doing. It's not self-aware in a sense that it's like mocking Zelda, but it really feels like a deconstruction of kind of Zelda lore and what it means to be a reincarnation of like Link, Ganon, and Zelda. And each of those characters are kind of a fun flip on what you would expect. And it's just beautiful. Like I think that game, like I think there are more impactful Zelda games in terms of like the effect they've had on like the industry. Like I imagine Tears of the Kingdom, we're going to see that ripple forward for a long time. Ocarina of Time, you know, has had a tremendous influence on games. Wind Waker, I think, is a little bit more niche, but it's like specifically kind of the tone I go after in a lot of my own writing and a lot of my own artwork as well. So Wind Waker's one of them. The Persona games, I love revisiting. Again, I think there's something that kind of connects Mass Effect, Persona, and Three Houses, where like those games kind of have that life sim part of it that I really love games that have that. And I've been really drawn more recently, as I've started to learn a little bit about game design, playing games that are like more on the visual novel side and more on even like the kinetic novel side. There's a game that came out recently called Misericord that is like mostly just reading and cool visuals and cool music, but there's just enough interactiveness that it feels like a game. So I've been interested in kind of learning about like how far could you push that? Like where does the boundary between like this is just a comic book and this is a game kind of begin and end? But yeah, I mean, I think the big ones for me on a personal level, definitely Final Fantasy VII, Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, the Mass Effect trilogy, and I'm trying to think if there's any. I mean, Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross. A lot of like 90s RPGs are like permanently in my heart and mind. So yeah, those are the big ones.
What is it about games that keeps you just interested in? You sort of started getting in there a little bit and with Misericord. So with Misericord, it could be basically a comic book. If you push that sort of game to I guess like this most static version, you've got a comic book. So why does making it a game feel any different or more exciting? Like what is it about that experience that draws you more than say a graphic novel or a book or a movie?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, and I think it's not a coincidence that I'm also like alongside games, I am more likely to read a book or a comic than like go to the movies these days. But I think it's really, if I had to draw like a connection between like games and reading, or in what it is about playing a game that is like exciting to me, it is the role of the player. I think there is something intimate psychologically about, you know, being the one in control or holding something close to you, or even when you're reading, like the fact that it is up to you to like visualize what's happening. You know, you are kind of more of an active participant than you are in film or TV. Not to say that that's worse, it's just different. And I think I've always been drawn to like being a participant in that story. And I think it can lead it to feeling really personal. I think games unfortunately have a reputation for having like really toxic spaces online, and that's awful. But I also think it's the flip side of the fact that people feel a really personal connection to these games. And in warped and disturbed cases, maybe they feel an ownership over them. And that's like not the right way to think about it. But I do think it's a symptom of just like when you invest that much time and money into an experience, and it's really just like you in the driver's seat, it's hard not to just inherently feel emotionally invested. Like I think going back to Last of Us, not to spoil that game, but in the very beginning, you know, in the flashback with Joel's daughter, the game very cleverly lets you play as his daughter. Like the first and the game kind of tricks you into thinking like, is this the girl on the cover? Like, why am I playing as her? And what ends up happening is, I think, way more impactful just simply because you were playing as her than it would be if you were just watching that cutscene. So it's a little bit beyond description in terms of like what it is, but I do think there's something about the involvement of the player that like can raise the emotional potential of games a little bit higher than some other media for me.
I think that was very well put. And I think I recall asking a question to Into the Aether at one point, and you might have given that a very similar answer. And I wanted to make sure we capture that here too. I think back to that, you know, I don't remember what the question was or how exactly it was answered, but I do recall you making a connection between books and games that was very, very unique. And again, you've just put it there once more of the agency that both of these mediums require, rather than just sitting down and staring at a screen and watching it unfold in front of you, right? But if you want that involvement, and I wasn't a big reader until I was probably 26 years old, but I oddly found that the reading and games inhabit a very similar space for me. I can almost interchange them and get the same sort of fulfillment out of it. Books take a little more work because I'm trying to fill in the gaps and the spaces with, you know, my imagination about what this world looks like and who these characters are, where games sort of fill that void for me and allow me just to kind of tinker and have fun. But either way, they're still filling that same sort of like excitement. What's around the corner, I don't know, but I get to be the one that builds this and creates that space, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you get out of fighting games? What's that draw for you? Because you're like the RPG guy to me, the story guy, the narrative, and then all of a sudden you come bursting in with
Third Strike or Guilty Gear Strive XRD Rev 2. Yeah. I feel like it's like my inner jock. It's like I'm like 90% theater kid, and then there's like a meathead somewhere within me who's like, yeah, punch. I mean, I think fighting games, going back to like, my formative years, like that was always the social piece. Like,
oh sure,
I think my first big fighting game was Tekken 3, and I played that all the time with my dad on PS1. We would like just sort of catch up while we did 8 versus 8 all random. And like that was thrilling. And I think fighting games have always been kind of social for me. Like Smash Brothers, obviously, Soul Calibur, growing up with that. But more like I think in college was sort of the turning point of like, this is a social party game to like, I'm interested in the mechanics of this. Was when Street Fighter 4 came out and Marvel vs. Capcom 3. That was also, I think, just the time when interest in fighting games was starting to like percolate again. And now I think it's like more alive than ever, which is really cool to see. But I think for me, it's like, I love the focus on like, it's all mechanical. Like it's almost, being free of anything else is like kind of thrilling. But I think it's also on sort of my artist theater side, it's a full celebration of character. Like the cast in these games are always so ridiculous and so fun and so over the top that I love just being like, I'm going to choose someone based purely on vibe and like try to make this work with raw numbers, So I just think it's that. And I think the music, like a lot of my favorite fighting games are really influential in terms of like the artwork and the music that I like, the atmosphere. I think because you have such few elements, the elements that are there have to be like at 11, So it's hard to put into words. I also feel like what I'm learning is maybe I should just start watching wrestling, because I feel like what I'm saying right now is all leading to that. But yeah, I think it really is the focus on character that I think draws me specifically in.
So you played Tekken with your dad, and I've heard on the show on Into the Aether, your sister as well have had a bond over video games as well.
Yeah,
and again, you earlier mentioned that I think y'all had a NES in the house, the old Nintendo in the house, at the time you were born. So this has been prevalent within your family, not just you.
It definitely hit me the hardest, for sure. I've been thinking about that a lot, because actually I recently visited Jersey and I was with my mom, and I brought my Switch, and we always play Mario Kart when I'm home. She loves Mario Kart, and she's always really loved like all the Nintendo stuff. And we had the PlayStation at my dad's house, and he like, I think in retrospect kind of just like put up with a lot of it, but he also genuinely loved Tekken, and he loved Resident Evil 2. Like we played Resident Evil 2 like kind of cooperatively. Like we would figure out the puzzles together. Underrated co-op game that's not actually present in the game, but is fun to play with your dad. But all that to say, like I was, the show comes up with them every now and then, and they'll share what experience they have. Both my parents have a genuine interest in it. And I think if they were born a little bit later, I could see them both like having a place in their life for games. Because they also mentioned being like really into arcades, because they were both born in 1960. So like they were in their 20s during like the heyday of like Pac-Man and sort of the Namco Midway arcade games. And they recently opened an arcade in my town where my mom lives, and she said we should go. So like I do think it was something that they were both like fully interested in and enjoyed, but I think it stuck around more for me than anyone else. But it was nice. Like I do appreciate that like everyone in my family was like, no one kind of belittled it. They were all really interested, or at least like, we're content that it was like my thing. Like, that's nice. Steven could do his thing. One weird note that I'll give you is that like, I don't know what this means or what it represents, but whenever I was playing a game and my mom came in the room, she would say, "This is like one of my dreams," which I still don't fully know what that implies, but I think she was dreaming of being a gamer. So, it definitely runs in the family.
That's how you take it. Dreams of
the gamer. Maybe those are nightmares now that I say it out loud, but yeah. Yeah, so yeah, all the Hilgers are into games in varying degrees.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Want to move towards thinking about the future of games and sort of what keeps you interested in the medium today and what you're looking forward to going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I love seeing the next big AAA stuff, but I really think the indie space is where my heart and attention is. The big thing is like the tools to make games have become increasingly more available. which I think is a net positive. And that I think kind of raised, like, it's not too distant of a memory to think about the first time I played Cave Story, which I think came out in 2004. And that was, in my experience, one of the first times I heard the phrase indie game. Like, I didn't even know that could really exist. The idea of just someone in their room making a game. Like, I had played maybe like Flash games online, like as a kid, or like Homestar Runner stuff. Stinko Man, incredible game. But like seeing a game like Cave Story where like one person made this game that's like on the level of what Nintendo makes, this is wild. And now we get Cave Stories like every week, which, like that is, Metroidvanias are one of the most popular genres of games in that space. And that's amazing. And I think what I'm excited about is where that's going, and it's interesting too to see like when one thing that I've been thinking about is like when big publishers like Nintendo specifically stop making a certain kind of game, what happens in the indie space? Like what indie developer will take that baton and push it forward? So like I think the classic example is Stardew Valley, where like the Harvest Moon games had kind of stopped, and then Stardew Valley came out, and now everyone is trying to make a farming sim, life sim game. And eventually someone's going to make the next big step, like I don't think we've seen it yet, but I think we're going to, and that's exciting. I think, again, like kind of tracing inspiration, we're at a time where like a lot of types of games that were maybe considered niche or had cult followings are now kind of becoming the mainstream direction for where games are headed. Like, again, like Stardew Valley. But the other thing too that I'm excited about is just like the things that come out of nowhere. Doing this show, like whenever we do our Game of the Year episode, we'll usually have a section where we're talking about like, what are you excited for this year? And there's always going to be a new, there's going to be a new Nintendo game. There's going to be a new Square game. Like, we already kind of go into a year excited for like 5 or 6 things. But then you have stuff like Hades that just drops. And that game was in early access for a long time, but like that felt like such a cool moment where this game came out and like stole everyone's hearts and minds. That's, I think, what I'm most excited for is what I have no idea is going to happen.
The unknown.
Yeah, it's a corny answer, but like it really is true. I mean, I think doing this show, like the games that just sort of drop and surprise us are always the most exciting. I just think we're at a really interesting point in game history. I definitely feel like there needs to be a restructuring on how AAA games come out, because they're just like ballooning in scope and cost, and in a weird way that does create a better landscape for indies in some way, because there's way bigger gaps where like these games are just not coming out. But I think what I would want to see the AAA space do, not that they have to exist in separate realities, but like I think looking at a game, what was it called? Hi-Fi Rush, I think was right. Yeah, that was a really interesting example of like Bethesda, like compare it to like Elder Scrolls 6, which might not even ever come out, and this is this like distant dream that like we'll see what happens with that, and we'll probably get it in like 10 years. And at that point, what do we even want? Like we just sort of project unsaid desires onto this thing that doesn't exist, and then it comes out and is not that, and it's just inherently disappointing. But Hi-Fi Rush comes out and is obviously not going after the same scope and height of a game like Elder Scrolls 6, but I think there's a lot of power in a game kind of knowing what its mission is, knowing exactly how long to be, coming out that day. And I feel like the reception to that game would not be as strong if it was like 2 years of hype. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to know, but I just wonder if we need to start asking AAA to like pull it back in a little bit and make shorter, more interesting stuff, rather than like this game is the biggest thing ever always, because that is just unsustainable.
Yeah, and it sort of has to me at least, it's lost its luster, right? Like, yeah, right. It's impressive at some level, but at some level, it's like I don't ever need that. Why? My life is bigger than I will ever need it to. Like the world, the world we live in is bigger than I need it to be at some point. I don't need my game to do that too. Or going back to what you said about books as well. Like I can build that universe in my head to be as big as I want it to, but it's really only about where my character needs to go to progress that story, or whatever. That's what's important, right? Just give me the core experience. Yeah, I don't mean to speak for everybody, obviously, but for me and myself, it's like I don't need.
No, but I don't think you're alone. I think there is like a general sense of fatigue with that, because I think we've also learned that the games that feel big are better than the games that are.
Totally. Good. Well said.
You could even look at Elder Scrolls 2 and 3 for that, where Elder Scrolls 2, I might be wrong, but Daggerfall is like technically one of the biggest games. Like the raw size of the world is like I think as big as like real life Wyoming or something, but it's all kind of copied and pasted, and like the game isn't benefiting from a big world. Whereas I think Morrowind and Skyrim specifically, I know Oblivion's my favorite, but Oblivion kind of has a little bit of Daggerfall issues with the copy and pasted world. But Skyrim and Morrowind are big games, but they feel big because there's a lot of stuff going on. There are a lot of like,
right?
Yeah, they're curated, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom are smart in that like those games are also very impressive in the scope of it, but they also are interesting because we are engaging with stuff in the world. Like in Tears of the Kingdom, we have all these powers that allow us to connect things and experiment. And there's all these different settings that are so alive and so full of intriguing things and characters. In Elden Ring, we have obviously the combat to pull us in, but we also have like so much actual mystery. Like Elden Ring is a game that will remind you what fantasy mean or could mean, like Final Fantasy VII. Like everyone points to that moment where you walk out and you see the red sky of Caelid, and it's just like, where am I? Like, I think genuinely feeling lost and scared in an open world game is an achievement, I think, because like, I think that wonder is kind of hard to do at this point because we're so kind of desensitized to scope.
That was part of my fear with Tears of the Kingdom coming out. Like I was one of the people where I played and loved Breath of the Wild, but when Tears of the Kingdom was rolling around the corner, I was like, I don't know how excited I am about this. Like I know it's going to be the same map basically, and there's going to be some bells and whistles, but like, is this really going to be that much more of am I going to get much more out of that experience than I got out of Breath of the Wild? And it turns out, in fact, yes, I am. And I'm getting more out of it than Breath of the Wild. Yes, I'm playing one of the 3 maps is the same, but there's, I think, a more curated experience in it where and my time with games has changed dramatically in the last year and a half with my daughter and work and all of that. And so I have to find games that are going to give me a lot with a little bit of time, right? And with Tears of the Kingdom being such a massive game, and knowing that because of Breath of the Wild, but I kind of jumped into it with some trepidation. But I can play that game and get the same out of it whether I play for 5 minutes or 2 hours. Like, oh yeah, I can do enough in those little moments of time with that game that feel like, oh yeah, I achieved something cool. I felt like I'd played that game for probably 60 hours already, and I looked at my time played and it was only 25 hours. And that to me tells me there's like it's very dense. The density, yes, the density of what's happening in that game makes it feel like it's a much larger experience than I'm actually having. And so I'm getting a lot more value out of that. So there's a few things with that, right? The value proposition of the game and the experience that I'm having, but there's also that the level of going back to unknown, assuming I made an assumption that I thought I would know what this game is based on the previous one, the Breath of the Wild, but it has completely just blown my mind yet again. And I think it's hard to find a game, whether it's good or bad, a game that doesn't provide you some level of new experience or new thing it's trying to do. I talked with Naoko a few episodes about the same thing where like video games in general are always giving you something new. And a lot of it has to do with that interaction or agency that's part of it. But some of it times it's just the artwork or the music or whatever. There's so much going on with games that you are bound to find something novel in it for a moment. And I think that's what makes them at least fascinating for myself.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, I know some people who didn't fully click with Breath of the Wild that are loving Tears of the Kingdom. And I think it's because if I had to kind of compare the two, like in Breath of the Wild, it's a very zen experience for a lot of it. Like you can really just get lost in like climbing a cliff for like several minutes as the wind blows by. And Tears of the Kingdom, like you look in one direction, you're like, I could either build a bridge or help that Korok or dive into that glowing pit or, like I give myself one mission and I end up with like 3 more if I walk in a direction, which it might sound overwhelming, but it's honestly, it's thrilling. Like it's a really incredibly designed game. So yeah, I think you're right to point out that like the time just feels longer in that game than it actually is.
Yeah, and I think with that too, there's, you initially start feeling, maybe that's the way it's brilliantly designed. You don't feel that being as overwhelmed in the beginning. You feel like you have a very sort of narrow path. People are kind of guiding you in a certain direction. The NPCs are saying, do this, do this, do this. And if you do that, you start naturally coming across those moments where there's like 3 things that I can see that I could do right now. But you realize as soon as I do one of those, there's going to be another 3 things. And you're never going to, that feeling of like, well, if I do that one, am I going to forget about these other 2? It kind of doesn't matter because you're just going to find 2 more things to do. And like, if you just let that carry you through the game, it's really kind of a special experience, right? I'll loop back to those things that I missed at some point. I'm sure I'll find them one day.
Yeah.
But there's going to be something new and exciting right around the corner regardless, right? So
right, versus kind of like a checklist of just stuff you feel like obligated to do, but you don't really want to, you know? Yeah.
There's an excitement in seeing the new thing. I guess maybe my last question. I know you all, Into the Aether has been on a break, as we mentioned earlier. You're coming back in, I would think by the time this episode launches, you've already come back. So welcome back. The show's been great. I love, yeah, it's I love the new season. The Dreamcast, what a cool console. Wow. Amazing. But I'm curious how you have felt, how you found this break to be. Has it been helpful for you? Have you again changed the way you've been playing games?
Yeah, so I guess for full context, like Brendan and I record every week, and like every blue moon we might do like a double because we have to, like, one of us will be busy. We usually record on Sundays, so like, we have had to reschedule, but basically in our 5 years of doing the show, we've never taken more than like a week off. So it was kind of weird to, like, it's been such a constant. I think we both kind of struggled to like not want to record something together. Like I when our break, quote unquote, began, I think we were still preparing for our Paper Mario bonus, and then we recorded that a week after we announced the hiatus. And then I recorded something with Brendan for his show Wavelengths, which was all about game news, and that was a lot of fun. But that was kind of almost like an accidental Into the Aether episode. And then we had to pivot to prepping for the Dreamcast episode, which we recorded in early July. So like we announced the hiatus and everyone was really supportive and like, enjoy your time off. But those first few weeks were like full Dreamcast prep mode, which was a lot of fun. But it was also like I had to really make time for that. It's felt like actually a break this past week. We come back on August 2nd. That's when the Dreamcast episode is coming out, and then we're going to start recording again after that. I'm honestly really excited. Like I think what I've learned taking a break is I miss doing the show. I'm glad we did it because I think we also both had really busy summers. So I think if we hadn't taken this time off, it would have like conflicted with the show. But in terms of how it's affected my time with games, in the last, after we recorded Dreamcast, I was able to I'm like, I don't actually have to play anything now. I can play whatever I want. And it's been nice. I mean, it's kind of, it hasn't been too different. I'm still just playing whatever I want. I still have an instinct to check out games I haven't played before, but it's been nice to kind of indulge and because, I think there's always something in the back of my head where it's like, okay, I have time for like one game to play a lot of that I'm not going to bring to the show. If it's just something that I want to play for fun and don't necessarily want to talk about, or like something I've already talked about and don't really have more to say about. And then there's also like, oh, I need to make time for whatever the bonus is. So it's been nice to just not have that pressure and like fully, I've been playing Persona 4 Golden again because I've never played that iteration of the game, and I got it on Steam Deck like a year ago. And unlike the first time I played where I just binged it, I've been kind of like slowly chipping away at it. So I think it's been nice to just be able to play something at my own pace and not feel like I have to like stop what I'm playing to make time for something else. But honestly, like I think the remarkable thing is it's not noticeably different. I think like we've done a pretty good job maintaining, again, that sort of like organic interest with the show that I'm kind of doing that on my own time as well. But I also don't feel like there is a little bit of pressure to be like, okay, what are you bringing this week? And not having that has allowed me to just sort of like take a more leisurely pace with some games and to also kind of get like some time with my backlog that like isn't related to an episode or a bonus.
Do you ever feel burnt out playing games in general? Seems to be your medium of choice.
Yeah, very rarely. I think there have been times for like really tight deadlines I think I got pretty close with the Paper Mario episode. Like I wasn't able to finish that game. Like I got to the very end, and Will and Brendan had finished it, but I was like on the last chapter and didn't get to finish it. And like I loved my time with that game, but I feel like I would be enjoying this more if I wasn't like kind of crunching it a bit to get done with it. And that was also kind of one of the reasons why we, not necessarily that episode, but like we just kind of saw how much we were assigning ourselves. And I think taking a hiatus and thinking about the structure of the show, and if we wanted to like tweak anything to make sure that we're always enjoying the process, that's always been really important to us. And very, very rarely do I feel like, I got to play video games. Like it's usually, I think it comes off on the show that we're like enjoying what we're doing.
On that note, I do think I am going to wrap it up. Unless there's anything else you want to bring up or say. Again, the purpose of the show, why the hell do any of us care about this at all? As much as we do. And I think there's a lot of good reason for it. And you've brought up a lot of good reasons here. Anything else you want to bring up?
Honestly, just thank you for having me. I mean, like, this is for context. Like I haven't recorded since the Dreamcast episode, so you're catching me like in the thick of my break. So I am glad you trusted me to come on the show and be a solid guest. But I had a great time. Like I really love this show. I think it's a great topic to discuss because it is like kind of the elephant in the room. You know, it's a new enough thing that it's worth exploring why there's this passion for it past like it's fun or it makes money. So I had a great time. I appreciate you having me on.
All right, Stephen Paul Hilger, I'm going to let you go. You enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you once again. And thank you for everything you do on Into the Aether and otherwise. I wish you well in your endeavors of game development and getting into that. That's a whole other thing we could have gone down the road of, but I'll let you stew on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm still very early on in that, so I think that might be a conversation for like maybe in like a year or two. We can talk about that because right now it's like it's pretty cool to learn. So I'll come back when I have more hard data for you.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, on that note, you have a wonderful evening. Thanks again.
You too.
And take it easy.
Bye, Kyle.
My thanks to Stephen Paul Hilger for taking the time to chat. If you haven't listened to the Brendan Bigley or AJ Filari episodes of Why Button, those would be great follow-ups to this interview. But maybe even better would be to just subscribe to Into the Aether. So I have a little announcement. This is the last episode of what I'm calling Season 1 of Why Button. I don't have any concrete plans for Season 2, but that's the point of Season 2. Instead of doing bi-weekly episodes, I'm going to post episodes as they come. Maybe the next episode drops tomorrow, or maybe it's 2 years from now. It's anyone's guess. I still have a list of folks I'd like to interview and some who've already agreed, but life just keeps getting in the way. And that's the point. I'm going to focus my attention on life for a bit. When I started this show, I needed it. I was in a rut and needed a creative outlet. Well, I've had some really positive life changes recently, and my time to work on the show has become more and more limited. Until things calm down a bit, I'm gonna fit it in as time permits, when I want and can do it. As I take a little break, I want to recommend checking out the podcast My Perfect Console by Simon Parkin. Simon is one of my favorite writers and games critics, and the show is very much doing something similar to Why Button, albeit with some very notable guests. You should also check out the aforementioned Into the Aether and DLC from previous guests Christian Spicer and Lana Bashinsky. If you enjoyed this episode or the show, please share it with a friend. The easiest thing to do is to share the website whybutton.online. It includes links to the most popular podcast platforms. I'd also appreciate a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else supports that kind of thing. If you want to get in touch, ask me questions, or recommend future guests, feel free to reach out to whybuttonpodcast@gmail.com or on Mastodon at whybutton@mastodon.social. You can also find me on Mastodon at Kyle Starr at mastodon.social. I'm also on Threads at _Kyle Starr. This episode was produced by the very talented AJ Filari. Thanks again, AJ, for being part of Season 1. Our theme song was written by Childstar, who's me, featuring my friend Scott Wilkie. It's called On the Same Page, and you can find it on all streaming platforms. Thanks again for listening to Why Button. And remember, when you press Y, ask why.